Good morning. We're going to try this again. I turned my phone internet off. I thought driving into town and trying to do a live was challenging because of all the dead spots, but apparently AT&T really does stink. Because I've been sitting here and I cannot keep my phone connected. So I turned my Wi-Fi off. Let's try this again. Good morning, everyone. We're going to carry on just a few minutes. I wanted to do this at the office because there are some verses that I want to read to you. So I decided to come in a little early and let's dig in very quickly. I don't want to take all morning, but I want to give you guys some verses for consideration, considering the law of God. I feel like oftentimes the reason that our country and that our families are in the shape they're in is because we have no more fear, and I remain that in the reverence of God and what our what is the word I'm looking for? Our punishment is going to be, the repercussions of sin that are going to be in our life by not keeping the law of God, because we want to sweep the law of God under the rug and say that it's done away with. We see very plainly in Matthew where YAHSHUA said, I did not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill, which means that word in Strong's, which means to show you how, or to give a correct interpretation of. And then he goes on to say, and those of you who teach others not to keep my law, you are going to be least in the kingdom. So we need to be very careful when we instruct people not to obey the law of God. But 2,000 years removed from the beginning of the church, or the called out, the ecclesia, we don't have a clue what it means to be in a kingdom, kingship, honor, shame, all of those things. And because the enemy was very smart and come in, and the first thing he did was change God's calendar and change his Sabbaths and change things hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago. And so here we are in today's church society, and we never take the time to dig in and seek out truth. We just take it for granted that because mom and daddy were this or that and generations back, that this is the truth of God. And we're getting lazy, and we're getting to the point where we don't fear God because we don't know his commandments. And we're taught in the church that they're not valid. And I'm speaking of the Torah. And we're even told that it's bondage. And that just absolutely flabbergasts me. Why would God deliver the children of Israel out of Egypt, out of bondage, only to put them back into bondage? Doesn't make any sense. So let's go to the New Testament this morning, and I'm going to share just a few verses for you to consider. Did the apostles teach to do away with the law of God? So we see, first of all, Paul is hard to understand, and we know this. Peter tells us this, that if you don't pay attention, for those that are unlearned, that they will twist the words of Paul and make them hard to understand, or distort the word. So in order to understand Paul, you must, and this is 2 Peter 3:17, you must go back and understand the front of the book. So you understand what Paul is saying, because Paul would not be teaching against Torah. He was a rabbi. He was brought up at the feet of Gamaliel. He was the rabbi of rabbis. And he taught from the Torah Jesus, YAHSHUA. How did he do that? Because he understood the front of the book is how he did that. So let's go and take a quick peek. Romans 7:12, wherefore the law is holy and the commandments just and good. The law is holy and the commandments are just and good. This is Paul, Romans 7:12. Romans 3:31, now do we then make void the law through faith? God forbid. We Establish the law. That word there meaning Torah. And Torah, law, actually should be translated in our versions, and it is not. Instructions. The law is instructions from God to teach us how to be in his presence and to teach us how to be holy. Okay? Acts 24:14. But this I confess unto thee, after the way which they call heresy, so worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which were written in the law and the prophets. This is Paul. He believes all things in the law and the prophets. He follows after the way. You're going to hear the word the way from the very beginning of the book. It sets apart. It is a signature understanding of those that follow the God of Israel. In 1 Corinthians 5:8, we see this. Therefore, let us keep the feast, not with unleavened, not with old leaven, neither with the leaven of malice or wickedness, but with unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So here we see, and I'm not going into that, where they're saying, they're teaching about the feast of the Lord. He said, so let us keep the feast this way. If the feast had been done away with, then why would he be telling the people to keep the feast? Let us therefore keep the feast. For years I read that verse and never saw it, never understood it, never dawned on me that here we have the apostles teaching about the feast of the Lord after the death of YAHSHUA, after his death. Remember, YAHSHUA said, I did not come to do away with the law. He did not come to do away with the law. Okay, the law of God is eternal. The Torah, YAHSHUA is the living word. He is the light. The Torah is the light. It's our instructions. He didn't come to do it. When we tell people that the Torah is done away with, that the law of God is done away with, what we are saying is our God breaks covenant. Because God said his law, his faith, his instructions were eternal. That his Sabbath was forever and to be kept. Even the sojourner that would join themselves to Israel. So this is not a Jewish thing. The feasts were set up long before, or not long, but days before man was even created. That's how important they were. And he established the seasons. That word is his holy convocations, his appointed times, okay, for us together, because this is how we're going to learn to know him, to watch for him, to understand what's coming, to understand how to worship the King, okay? He is the King, not us. We don't have a right to change anything. So let's go on and see what more the apostles say about the law of God. In John 14 and verse 15 through 21, John is speaking here and he says, if you love me, keep my commandments, keep my instructions. He that hath my commandments and keepeth him, he it is that loveth me. So when we tell people not to keep the commandments of God, we are telling them not to love God. Because to love God is to keep his commandments. Okay? I mean, why would we tell someone that the law of God is not relevant, that it's done away with? It doesn't sound like John thinks they're done away with. Okay? It is he that loveth me. He that loveth me shall be loved by my Father, and I will love him. I will manifest myself to him. This is people that walk in Torah. People that understand the importance of keeping the law of God. In Matthew 23, 1 through 3, we see YAHSHUA here telling the disciples to do what the Pharisees, what is being taught from Moses' seat. When they read from Moses' seat, and Moses' seat was where they read the law, they couldn't commentate, but they read straight out of the Torah, the law of God. He said, you do what they say do. But don't do as they do because they've messed it up. I'm here to show you how to do it. But as long as they're reading from Moses' seat, you do as they say. We see this again in Acts 15 at the Jerusalem Council, where they were telling the Gentile believers, okay, these were believers coming in, and the Jewish people were trying to, play the power card, and that we've had the law longer than you need to do what we say attitude. And they were trying to convince the new converts they had to do certain things like circumcision to be saved. And the whole thought process was for salvation. That's the key, for salvation. And so they come to the council at Jerusalem, and the Jerusalem council sent out a decree by Barnabas and Paul, and they said, you tell these new converts to don't get too overwhelmed. I'm paraphrasing. Don't eat blood, don't eat things sacrificed to idols, abstain from fornication, and the rest you will learn each Sabbath day as Moses' law is being read in the synagogues. Why would they be sending new converts, Gentile converts, to the synagogue on the Sabbath to learn the law if it had been done away with? These are legitimate questions. Why would he tell them to go on the Sabbath? Apparently, he didn't get the memo that just because Yeshua raised from the dead on Sunday that they're supposed to now worship on Sunday. Because the Sabbath, God said, was his day forever. That was his people's basically wedding ring. Everything about, from the beginning of the book to the end of the book, is about a marriage, about covenant vows to our God. And that is how it's portrayed over and over and over in the scriptures. We also see in 1 John 2, verse 6, he that saith he abideth in him ought also to walk even as he walked. Who? Yeshua. If you want to, if you are walking with him, you will walk like him, John said. So what did Yeshua do? If he came to change something, there would have been specific instructions that we're doing this now, but after I die, guys, you're not going to have to eat kosher anymore, and you're not going to have to keep the Sabbath anymore, and my feast days, they don't matter anymore. We're going to join the pagans and worship. You guys are going to worship me on the pagan holidays like December 25th and Easter instead of Passover. These are counterfeits that were brought into the church. These have nothing to do with Yeshua and his feast days. They are actually an abomination to him, and we should be very careful what we call holy when the Lord said anything that was done in worship to a false god is not acceptable. It is an abomination. So when we say, well, it don't really matter, when we celebrate, everything matters. The reason we say that is because we have no respect for the law of God, for his instructions, his kingdom, his instructions. We have no say. Doesn't matter what I think. Doesn't matter that I think the tree represents this or that it's when everybody else does it, or that's, and then we don't even do it correct then. We've got Yeshua in the manger with all the wise men around him. The wise men didn't show up till he was 2. So we don't even get that right. But yet we incorporate a pagan holiday into the assemblies of God and call it holy. We need to be careful. And it all comes back to the law. We have to understand the law of God and the consequences there are for not following it. That creates the fear, the reverence for God, not to do something for our salvation, but to want to serve him and honor him his way. Because he said, if you love me, you're going to keep my commandments. Because you're saved, because you've had that circumcision of the heart, because you love me, You want to be like me. How many of you as children, me as a child, I would see my mom cooking in the kitchen and I would think, I want to be like her. I want to know how to do all of that. The boys see their father out working, and their dad, man, he is everything. They want to walk like him and talk like him. They want to imitate everything Dad does because Dad is so cool. That's the same concept that we're looking here. God has done so much for us that we want to be like him in every possible way. And the instructions that are in the Torah teach us how to know what sin is so we can avoid it, and to walk as he walked and do what he did, to have a clean heart, a pure heart, because we are his, not to earn anything. And that was the whole issue Paul was having with many of the churches. And remember that when we read the word law, it is not always the law of God we're talking about. There's the law of sin and death. And 90% of the time, what Paul is addressing is the penalty the law brought. The law of sin. The law that says that sin has a penalty that is death. And because of that, we were subject to death until Messiah came. Until Messiah came and gave his life and was our perfect sacrifice. And now through him and his blood, we are saved by his grace through our faith. And so now that we're saved, now we're learning to walk in his instructions so that we can be like him. Does that make sense? Good morning, Eva. Give me a comment. Does that make sense? Is that how we're taught about the law in the churches? No, we're taught the law is bondage, and God said my law is perfect and just and good. Read Psalms 119. How does that whole chapter talk about the law of God? It talks about it being eternal. Why is it eternal? Because the word is YAHSHUA. He is eternal. His word is eternal. He cannot speak against the Torah, or he wouldn't be the Messiah. So let's use our brain to think when we're reading the scriptures and decipher truth from doctrine, and then audit what we believe. And if we're wrong, be humble enough to say I'm wrong. If I am ever wrong, or if I am wrong about something that I have taught or spoken, I will gladly come back and say, you know what, guys, I thought I understood that, but I really missed something here. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to apologize because I misunderstood that. This is what it's really saying. There is nothing wrong. We are all growing. We're on a journey. We understand differently at different levels of our maturity in the Word of God. That's why we have teachers to help us to see. That's why the Holy Spirit was given, to give us wisdom and understanding. We're not going to get it all in one sit down, 30-minute, 20-minute, and read through the scriptures and put the Bible down. You have to dig in and seek him. There's a difference in reading the Bible and seeking his truth. Because if you want truth, you'll find it. But if all you are looking for is confirmation on what you think you already know, God cannot take you anywhere else. If you are content to just know what you know and think you have it all figured out, then there is no way the Holy Spirit can reveal the more to you. So we see here the apostles, and there are so many other instances in the Brit Hadashah of the apostles keeping Torah. I'm trying to find a specific. This is in Isaiah. And I'm going to close with this. And this is in reference to the millennial reign when the Lord comes back. Okay, so this is future that Isaiah is talking about. So I want you to listen very carefully to what he's saying here, because I want you to get the understanding I'm trying to present to you today. And Isaiah says it right here, Isaiah 24, 3 through 5. The earth is also defiled under its inhabitants because they have transgressed the law of Torah, the instructions of God. They have transgressed the law, changed the ordinance, and broken or made void the everlasting covenant. This is in the millennial reign. And he's talking about them breaking Torah and the covenant. And they've defiled the earth because of it. So if Torah is done away with, how have they defiled the earth by not keeping it? Think about that. Isaiah said, when the Lord comes back, he's going to find the earth defiled because they have transgressed Torah and changed its ordinances. We are guilty, friends, of changing the ordinances of the Almighty God when we say, and I'm using this for an example, Sunday's the Sabbath. Nowhere in the New Testament do we see the disciples keeping Sunday and telling the new converts to keep Sunday as the new Sabbath. Because, see, when we say that, we are changing the covenant. Because God said, my covenant is eternal for Israel and for the sojourner that will come. That's us. So when we join ourselves to Israel, when we're grafted into Israel, we are grafted into that covenant. And when we say the law is done away with, we are defiling the earth because we are speaking against the instructions of God. And God said that those who do that will be least in Matthew 5 in the kingdom. In Isaiah 56:1, blessed is the man who does this, the man who holds it fast, who keeps the Sabbath without desecrating it, and keeps his hands from doing evil. For I'm having trouble reading my writing, I'm sorry. In verse 5 through 6 of Isaiah 56, it says, for you'll be blessed by keeping the Torah or the instructions of God. So if in the front of the book, we're reading that the Torah is good and that we're going to be blessed for keeping it and that God's Sabbath is forever and that when he comes back, he's going to find the earth defiled because we're not keeping Torah. Let's take time and let that sink in. God's law is precious. Precious. It is gold. It is how we are face to face with him. We're not separated with that middle wall of petition. We're all one. There's one faith. There's one law for the Jew and the Greek. It's not about trying to be Jewish. That burns my biscuits when people say that. It has nothing to do with being Jewish. It has to do with honoring the law of God. Just so happens that our faith is rooted in our Jewishness. And we don't even get that. Our Messiah was Jewish. The Torah is his instructions to the Jew and the Greek. That's us. So we cannot say that keeping law is a Jewish thing. There's only one law. YAHSHUA came to teach us how to observe it correctly, so that all these fences and walls that the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin and the leadership of that day had corrupted it and made it such a burden on the people. And he come to tear that down and do it correctly. Not so we don't have to. That's ridiculous. He came to show us how to do it. It's like you start in first grade and you learn your letters. You learn to write them. You learn their sounds and you learn how they fit together to make words, and you begin to recognize words. And in the second grade, you learn and you add to, you start learning to make sentences, and you start learning verbs and nouns, and you get all the way up to high school, because each year you're learning something new. And then you graduate. Everything that you learned, do you do away with it when you go to college? That's your foundation to lead you to more. You don't throw away what you learned. You take it with you because that's your foundation. Torah is our foundation. It's our light. It's our lamp. It teaches us how to stay in the way. It guides us. It gives us light. It teaches us who we are in Messiah and how to be like him so we can be in a face-to-face relationship with him. The law is good. And I dare anybody in my presence to say the law is bondage. I'm sorry. I love my God. I love my King. I love my Messiah. And when people speak against his truth, and Psalms calls the Torah truth. When Yeshua comes in Revelations with that sword that comes out of his mouth, and in Isaiah that speaks of it as fire, that is the Torah. We are going to be judged by Torah. Judgment is coming, guys, whether we want it or not, whether you feel you are right and justified or not, whether you feel Sunday's the Sabbath or not. We are all going to be judged by the Torah from God's mouth. When his mouth opens and that sword comes out, that's the Torah. That's what we're going to be held accountable to. The law of God that we're supposed to be upholding in the earth, to be that light to the nations. It's not about trying to earn anything. It's about honoring God and standing firm on his truth. Not a doctrine that teaches us to do away with the commandments, to change the Sabbath. And let me just address the verse in Acts that says on the first day of the week, the disciples gathered together. That word day is not in the scriptures. Look at it. It's in italics. They added it. That word there is Sabbaton. That word there is Sabbaths. They were meeting on the first of the Sabbath. What does that mean? Well, if we went back and understood the front of the book and studied the feasts that the church wants to do away with and say they're not important, if we understand what that is, then we understand that we're counting the Omer to Pentecost, to Shavuot. From Passover to Shavuot, you count the Omer 50 days to Shavuot, the day of Pentecost. They were in the countdown. It was the first of the Sabbaths they gathered together to break bread. But we don't know that, because all we see is the Greek translation where they have added the word day and we read right over it. And because our church doctrine says that Sunday is now the day because that's when Christ rose from the dead. And do we have a commandment saying thou shalt keep Sunday, the day of the sun god, the day that is the seal of Baal? It is the seal of a pagan god, Sunday worship. God said, my mark for my people, his seal, is that they keep my Sabbath on the seventh day. So if we're not, and if we're teaching others not to, whose seal are we wearing? Whose mark? and put that into context with what Revelation speaks of in the last days. It's scary because there are a lot of people that are misled concerning God's law. And we just read in Isaiah, speaking of the millennial reign, that when he comes back, he's going to find his people defiling the earth by not keeping his covenant. Because his covenant is everlasting. I hope this has been a benefit. We're going to go further. We're going to go deeper. But this is some things that I challenge you. Don't listen to me. Look it up. That's why I gave you the verses. Because we're taught that the New Testament only teaches about the grace of God. And it does, and I am so thankful for the grace of God. But it does not teach against the law of our Messiah. So, and there's another verse in Acts where Paul says that he is innocent when it comes to the law. In other words, he kept the law faithfully. You guys have a blessed day. Thank you so much for joining me. Leave your questions, comments, private message me. I would love to talk with you more about this. Shalom.